Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Handling Finances class as part of the directorship program here for Pathfinders. I'm very excited to be here tonight with everybody. As it says on the screen, my name is Kayleen Chadwick, and I find that whenever I start a presentation with people that I don't know, I always let them know where this weird accent comes from, so that you're not thinking too much about the accent while we do the presentation. So I said my name's Kayleen. I was born in Australia. I've lived in New Zealand and Africa and grew up in England, spent a lot of time in California, and now my home is here in Berrien Springs, Michigan. So just a brief background, I've done Pathfinders now as a child, but when I became an adult, I've done it now for 10 years, since since the Oshkosh on Joseph. So why don't we go ahead and get started with a prayer and ask God to be here on with our seminar. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you so much that we can be here tonight to learn how to look after the gifts that you've given us of money with the kids that we work with. Help us to be able to understand the information that we hear, and may your name be gloried and honored. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so when you think about finances, I always like to start with a verse from the Bible. And this is a verse from 1 Peter 4, verse 10, and it reads, "As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God." So as a Pathfinder director, not only are you looking after the children that have been entrusted to you, you're also looking after the money that the parents give you to run the club. So this verse says that God wants us to be stewards of everything. So that means we need to be stewards of the money that the parents entrust to us. And you might be a bit overwhelmed by thinking, well, how does it all work? What do we charge? How do you put everything together? Well, tonight we're going to be going over that and putting everything very, very simply. I do have an accounting degree, but I've tried to forget that I have that with this presentation so that everybody can look after finances in a club. So, next slide. So what is a budget? You've probably heard that term before. I don't know if any of your families keep a budget. My husband and I, we do a budget for our house. When I've done finance jobs, we do a budget. A budget basically means, like my picture shows here, everything needs to balance on the weights. On one side, you've got your income, and on the other side, you've got expenses. And you never want the expenses to be heavier than the income. They either need to be equal or the expenses need to be lighter. And if the expenses are equal or lighter, you're always going to have money in the bank or at the church if that's where you're holding your money. So just a little picture there. So I'm going to give you a handout in just a moment, and we're actually tonight going to do a budget. There's nothing like learning by doing. So I'm excited about doing a budget with you guys. So the first thing I'm going to hand out to you is a calendar. This is one that I used with the PNC Evergreens last semester. So I'd like you to just take a look at this calendar. And go over it and try and think in your mind things from this calendar that would mean, oh, we've got to spend dollars on this. We're not going to worry about income yet. We're going to do the expenses first. So does anyone see anything there that would cost money to do?
Oshkosh.
Yes, Oshkosh. We'll leave that one off the calendar for this purposes, okay, because that needs its own entire budget separate.
Training. There's a nature afternoon that
yes,
may require some
supplies. Mm-hmm. That's part of honors, because they might be nature honors.
Club camp out.
Club camp out, that's a huge one. So, yep. Okay. So you've you've got the idea, up on the screen here, shot here, I've shown you a few things that I picked out. I've got the club campouts, and on this calendar there was, the camporee was Oshkosh, but normally there is a conference camporee. And then there's the club campout, and here in Michigan Conference there's a team snow outing in January, and a Pathfinder fair in May. All these things will take a lot of money. Progressive classwork, so if you just see a progressive class on a calendar, that's going to cost. Maybe your fundraisers will cost. You might have to buy supplies to make money. And Pathfinder Sabbath, you might need to buy a copyright to a song that you want to sing in church, or to a poem that you're going to read, or a book of skits or things like that. So, what I'm going to give you next is our budget sheet, which is really easy to put together. So, here's a budget sheet. So what I'd like you to do is write down all those expenses that we thought of under expense. And I'm going to do it with you here. So I'm going to go over here and pull up this template here and open that up, and we'll do it together here as well as you're doing it on there. So down under expenses. So we said campouts, didn't we? We'll come back with dollar amounts afterwards. We're just thinking of categories at the moment. We said fundraisers.
You said come back to campouts?
We'll come back for the dollar amounts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Then we've probably got the progressive class. Uniform. We're going to have to buy uniforms for everybody. And we're going to have to spend on investiture supplies, because all those little patches are not cheap when you add them all together. Let's see, what else can I think of? Well, that's probably enough here to give an example.
Yeah, it's a Pathfinder Sabbath.
Pathfinder Sabbath. I like to do program expense too. Program expense would be things like buying your guidons, buying your club flags, any training materials. That's kind of what I would put under program expense. So, okay, so you've got a list of expenses. And let's go down to my next slide here. So let's think now, maybe on the back of the paper you can do some rough scratch numbers. I've done it enough putting a club camp out cost together that I can remember the numbers. When you've got a camp out, you're going to need, we're thinking about the dollar amount now, about what we want to put on a camp out. We're going to say that our club has 10 Pathfinders and 5 staff. I know those are small numbers, but it's just easier math for this. So with 10 Pathfinders and 5 staff, that's 15 people. Let's say we can all drive in 3 cars. I think 2 minivans, 3 minivans, and all the luggage we should be able to fit. And we're going to travel from here to our summer camp, because our camporee is always up at Campus Arbor in the state of Michigan. So that's 400 miles at about 50 cents a mile times 3. That's 1,200 miles. That's $600 on gas that we're going to give out, which is too much. Actually, it would be about 2 tanks of gas per car. So $150 for each car, $450 for gas. For transportation, $450. The conference will charge $10 for each person, so that's $150. The food, you could probably get away with, let's say $3 a meal. $3 a meal times 5 meals, let's say, I'm guessing, that's $15 times 15 people. 15 times 15, 10 times 50 is 150, that's $225 for food. So we've covered how many people, the cost of the campground, which is the conference fee, the cost of transportation, and the cost of food. And then I like to throw something in there just for padding. So let's put another $100 down there. So what do we come up with that the camp out would cost? $925. I'm going to round that to 1,000. I like to deal in lots of zeros with numbers rather than small ones. So if you come back to your budget sheet, let's put $1,000. But you know what? Camp Outs is more than Camporee. It's the club camp out and the Pathfinder Fair, so that's $3,000 because there's 3 camp outs. So let's put $3,000 there. Fundraisers, I'm going to pick something out of my head. I'm going to say we'll spend $500 on that. Progressive class, well, we have to get CPR training, but we could ask the kids to pay that. Let's say $10 for each Pathfinder, so we'll do $100. Uniform, if this club has been around a while, it's not like we're buying new uniform, and they're meant to be paying for the uniform themselves and everything. So uniform, we probably only need to put about another $200 in uniform. That's a guess. That's basically going to cover all your shipping, and it's going to cover for the times you actually give out a piece without forgetting to get the money from a kid to pay for uniform. Investiture supplies. Well, in your progressive class that you've planned, how many honors have you planned to teach this year? So you're going to have to go through a thought process on what you come up with on investiture supplies. So let's say I find that if you're a really active club, you might do 10 honors in 1 year. I mean, that's if you're meeting every week and you're covering honors on camp outs and you're just super active, and I like the number for rounding. So we'll go with 10 honors, and we'll say that they're 75 cents each. So 10 times 75, that's $7.50 just for the patches you give them. And then once you get the bar and the chevrons and the pins, you can add at least another $3 or $4 on that. So I'm going to say about $12 for each child for investiture. 12 times 10, $120. $120. Pathfinder Sabbath, I'm just going to think up a number there of $50. And program expense. Well, again, we're assuming the club's been around for a bit, so they've got a lot of the program supplies that they need. So we'll just put another $50 in there to replace things that are getting worn out. So if we come down and add that up, find my add button here. It's gone off the screen. There we go. Actually, I'll go through all these lines here. So somehow, if you remember the picture of our scales, we have to have at least $4,000 now to pay for these expenses. So we need to make sure that we've got that money coming in. I found in the past as working as a club director, you can't charge more for the registration fee than about $25 or $30 per child. So it depends. Are you going to do a registration fee and weekly dues? I'm going to assume here we're not doing weekly dues. So I'm going to do a club registration fee of $50. For 10 kids, it's going to be $500. So let's go back up the top to your budget sheet. And we've got an income there of club fees. And that's going to be $500. Because if you remember, we had 15 people on the camp out, but staff don't pay fees. Only the kids pay the fees. So $500 coming in from club fees. So we still somehow got to come up with $3,500. the next thing that you probably want to do at this point in your budget or in preparation for this point is visit your church treasurer and find out how much money the church will give you from their own budget to run the program. So when I was a club director of a club that had 20 kids, the church gave us $2,000 a year. So because in our situation here we have got 10, I'm going to say the church gives us $1,000. Now that is a church that means that they're right behind you and they're supporting you 100%. I've also been in clubs where there's more kids and you don't even get $1,000 from the church. So every church is going to be very different. But for this purposes, I'm going to put $1,000. So church subsidy is $1,000. So we are now $2,500 to our goal of making sure that our expenses and our income balance. So at this point you have to decide, well, how are we going to meet that shortfall? So let's see. Okay, 2 options. We can fundraise. We did put some fundraising expenses in there, but I like to put that item in last. First of all, we have to decide whether we're going to charge the kids when we go on a camp out. I've done it both ways. I've been in clubs where they don't pay dues, so instead they actually charge for you to go on a camp out. So I'm going to say here, yeah, we're going to charge for a camp out. We have 3 of them, and I'm going to say that we do $20 per person for each camp out. So let's do the math on that. 20 times 15 is $300. Okay? So each time we go on a camp out, we're going to collect $300. And if you notice, I actually included the staff there on that number. So 3 camp outs, $900. So these are going to be camp fees. $900. Great, we're getting closer. I'm going to have to add this up now.
Only 2,400.
That's $2,400. So we are still $1,600 short. Ladies, that is actually what we have to fundraise. So we know now that in order to meet this budget, we are going to have to fundraise the difference. So I'm going to put fundraising here. And so it was 4,020. So I'm going to go plus 4,000 minus, actually I'm going to go 4,500 minus 2,400. And I'm going to round this budget out to 4,500. Oops. Disappeared. I'm going to do a miscellaneous. Under program expense, I'm going to put it up to 480, 530. And if you notice now, let's see if I can, we have a balanced budget. 450 on income, 450 on expenses. In order to make it balanced, I just made it round numbers and slushed the fund. In one of the conferences that I worked at, I was then required, once the budget was put together, to sign it and then take it to my church board for approval and then send it into our conference director for Pathfinders. So when you come to that point on a budget, make sure you touch base with your area coordinator or you touch base with your conference director and make sure that you're following the protocol for your conference about what happens with your budget. I used to have to send it in every year with my calendar. So the time I found that I would do the budget is in February. Because the budget is the calendar is the beginning point of your budget. But the budget and the calendar go together because if you can't balance the budget, you're going to have to take something off the calendar before the kids see the calendar because you don't want to disappoint the kids and promise them a whole trip to Six Flags as the end of year reward and the club will pay for it, and then you come to the end of the year and go, oh, I don't have any money for that. So the calendar and the budget start doing in the late winter, early spring, so that you can get it to the church board in May. Typically, church boards don't meet over the summer, so you want to be prepared and ahead and have it in place before everything's swimming around. Good people to be involved with budget and calendar planning are your TLTs. You'll want to pull your key staff and your kids together and go through the previous year's calendar and say, what did you like, what did you not like, pull it all together, and then go through and cost, just pick out the items that are going to cost, and maybe look at last year's figures and just put these items together and just categorize things like we did here. And all of a sudden you have a budget that will see you through the year. So let me go back to our PowerPoint presentation here now and see where we're at. I go down, we've done that one, did that one, we did that one. I skipped a whole bunch of slides here, just went ahead with the example instead. Okay, so the budget's great. You know now what you're going to be spending on for the whole year. You know that you've only got limited resources, that a camp out better not cost more than $1,000, or else we're going to have to fundraise more money, or maybe we have a reserve from last year to put on, or maybe a parent will donate some money. One other line item you could actually add to your income that I forgot about was you will get unsolicited donations in the offering plate. There'll be church members in your church that will support your club, and I call those donations on the income. So for this intents and purposes, we're saying there are no donations, but that is another resource. As a director, if you know people who are passionate about Pathfinders, but they don't have time to be involved, then just quietly talk to them on the side and see if they would financially support you. Because I can guarantee you that between church subsidy and club fees, your budget will never be balanced. You're always going to be relying on fundraising and donations, always. So if you're a big club, you need to outsource this task. If you're a little club, as a director, you're going to be wearing a lot of hats. And I've had some surprising donations come in from my time as club directors, and I have no idea sometimes who they came from, and sometimes I did. So it's wonderful to see the support of the church in the offering plate. It's like you go into the treasurer at the end of the month and say, hey, what happened this month? They say, hey, you got $600. And you go, whoa, I can go buy those tents now. We won't get wet on the next camp out. I mean, it's as large as that. So, yeah. There's another expense that you could add is camping equipment. Let me tell you a little story here. Back a few years ago, I was in a church in California that had, when we arrived at that church, there were like 6 children and about 60 members, and I would say a good 30 of those were over the age of 65. But this church had a vision, and we were the 3rd family that joined the church. And they were a praying church, and they prayed for children. And I had a 9-year-old daughter who I knew would want to do Pathfinders, and I was like, these children, if we don't give them Pathfinders, then they're going to go to the church down the road that has Pathfinders, and then we'll even lose these few children that we have in our church. So I went to the board and asked if I could start a Pathfinder club. And I presented them with a budget of, I need $30,000 worth of equipment. And I spelled everything out. I shopped online, I got all my prices and everything. And they laughed at me. How can a little church of 60 people with a budget of $40,000 a year to run the whole church, when we want to do an evangelistic series, there's no way we can give you that. What can you start on? Let's be realistic. Let's cut it out. I said, okay, we don't need the trailer yet. We don't need the vehicle to pull the trailer. So there we go down and 10,000. And they still laughed at me and said, nope, that's not going to happen. So you start with a pancake breakfast and raise some money. So we did. Already from around the different churches that didn't have Pathfinder clubs, a few families came into our club. The first year we started with 16 children. Our church only had 6, if you remember, and most of those were under Pathfinder age. 3.5 years later, I had to leave the club to move here to Michigan. We had 120 members in the church. 60 of them were children from the age of 14 down. And the club had 25 children in the club, Pathfinders in the club. And when I left, I bought except for the vehicle to pull the trailer, when I left, I bought the last piece of equipment on my list. So I basically spent $20,000 over 3 years. So the reason it happened was because I always gave the church board good financials, and we did a ton of fundraising. Between 20 kids, we would raise $5,000 in the bike-a-thon. Some kids had some good connections, I guess. But the whole church was behind the club. So that's a story of how good finances and good planning on your part can get you what the club needs. And showing the church how the kids are responding to what you're doing, and having the kids talk about it in church and loving it in church is your key there. So, oh, by the way, in the second year, the church did add Pathfinders to their budget, and they started giving us $2,000 a year. So you come from the budget, and you're going through your months now in your Pathfinder calendar, and these events are happening, and you're spending money. This is where you have to know your own area of expertise as to what you want to do in the way of reporting what you're spending to your church board, because you need to be answerable to somebody. You can't just go spend the money and show nobody what you're doing. So there are different options. You can do something, if you all know Excel, you can open up a spreadsheet, and for every expense item that you have on your budget, you could have a different tab in Excel. And you just go down line by line. On April 1, I spent $25 at Staples. On April 2, I spent $200 at Amazon buying tents. So let's put that in the camping equipment tab. And you just add it up. And you just keep adding up each expense by each category on your budget. So that when it's time to give a report to your church board, you can actually do an income statement that looks exactly like your budget. It just got a different name on the top. And instead of making up the figures, this time you're actually going to add up the figures that you've actually done and spent. So this will just be really good for to take to your board and say, we brought in so much in camping fees, we brought in so much in donations, and we've spent it on investiture supplies, we've spent it on uniform. It's very simple that way. You just have to, you can add up on a piece of paper. You don't have to add it on a spreadsheet. If computers and you don't mix, then just have a separate, you have a notebook, and you just put each budget line on a separate piece of paper, and everything that you spend in that category goes on that piece of paper. What you do want to do, though, is, let me pull up that template on our sheet here so I can show you what I'm talking about. So let's say under Pathfinder registration fees, that pretty much will be the same. You did get the 10 kids, so you did get the 500. Camp fees. We said $900 here, but I'm going to say you only brought in $800 because a couple of kids didn't come to one of your campouts, so you made less. Then church subsidy was what we expected, and that was $1,000. And then it was fundraising. And we only made $1,500 in fundraising. So these are the numbers that you've added up on your separate pieces of paper. And let me look for my ad button here. Let's just add that up. So we didn't bring in 4,500, we've only brought in 3,800. So now our expenses need to be less than 3,800. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to lump all the expenses together for the sake of time. And I'm going to say we spent 3,500. So going down here, the total here is 3,500. And then I'm going to add the income. So a little add sign there. Go back up here. By the way, I'm in Google Docs, so you can, this is all free software. And then so I've added the income. I'm going to take away my expenses. And I've probably got $300 in the church fund. That's if I started the year with zero. I probably didn't start the year with zero, so let's say I started the year with $500 in the account. That means I'd actually have $800 in the church account. So by putting the income statement together, you want to make sure that you know it matches what's in the church. So I would actually go and ask the church treasurer for a printout of all your expenses. Compare it to all your tallies. Go through and put check marks, highlight, make photocopies, highlight and check mark things. Make sure you've got all your expenses recorded that the church has. Excuse me. And then the church will be happy because you have told them everything that you've spent the money on, that you've taken from the kids. And they'll be happy. So, do I have any questions? Have I just, is it simple enough? Yes.
What about, you start out your year, but you have something big of
Planning on
the
something
first
big.
place, or the first part of your year, and you haven't raised all the money yet, or it hasn't come in yet into the budget. Does the church let you,
Make a
take-
purchase and go negative?
Exactly.
Good question. Sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll say no. I've never gone in the negative. I've always had enough money to buy anything. So it's going to be a conversation with the director, the church pastor, and the church treasurer, and the church board for a vote for that. My husband has been church treasurer, and he would never allow a fund to go negative. So it was always wait. When we first started camping with this brand new club, we went with no tents. The families bought their own tents. But by the second camp out, a church member saw what happened, gave us $1,000, and we went and bought tents. So, word of mouth passed the hat around. Like, our tents ripped. When I went to Oshkosh, we lost 5 tents in the storm.
Oh,
And so we had to go out that day and buy those 5 tents. And God blessed and we covered it. I knew I had an emergency fund that could cover that. So that's also another thing that I budget there. So I would say in planning for long-term things, I would ask the church for a second fund. And one of your line items on your expense, on your budget, would be for large equipment. So let's say you were saving up for a trailer. So you could say, this year, we're going to buy a trailer over 5 years. And the trailer will cost us $10,000 or $5,000 to get a trailer. So every year, we're going to put $1,000 aside out of our everyday fund for this trailer we're saving up for. And the church can look after that for you in a different category so that you don't spend it. And then when you're ready to make that big purchase, the money's going to be sitting there in the church and they can cut you a check from wherever you need to buy that trailer from. So that's how I would tackle the big purchases. When putting that club together for the 20 kids, 25 kids, I had a camp equipment fund, and I was spending, maybe the first year I spent $3,000 But after that, it was about $1,000 a year. But once I left, everything was brand new, and they would have only had to have had a budget of about $200 or $300 to replace broken zips on tents and things like that. So there's some more figures there.
So really starting from the beginning is always a challenge because you're doing everything from scratch.
Finances, yes. However, you as the director, you get to set the tone of the club. I've come in as a director, brand new in a church, and designed the whole thing, including the club crest, the club t-shirt, everything. And it was a lot of fun, and we created the culture of the club. I've also come in as a director of a 50-year-old club, and that was a lot harder because I was brand new, the club was not, and there were people there that were not, and plus it was like 4 times bigger. And it was very, very hard because I wasn't doing all the things I was used to be doing because of the size difference, and the culture there was very different to the culture we had in my last club. It was learning to be a director again. So, but your key is keep your finances organized and present well to your church board. Present well on all your Pathfinder programs in church. Always put your best foot forward, and you'll win the church over. Even if you haven't won them at the beginning, you will win them over, and you will get more support in the offering plate and be able to fund your program much more. Yeah, being actively involved in everything at the church there. So that was it. Let me just check my. That was pretty much everything I had to show you. Oh, one last thing, yes, there was one thing. If your accounting knowledge is a little bit more computerized and you want to go beyond spreadsheets, I wanted to give you a couple of options that you could look at. If, like me, you were accounting background, I would suggest you could go with QuickBooks. QuickBooks is a software for small business users, and only if you understand accounting, use QuickBooks, because if you don't understand accounting, you'll just have a mess. So you can get that online. You can use a service where it's online. You can have multiple people logging in. So if you're in a large club, you might want to consider it because it's cloud-based for that, or you can put it on a PC, or you can put it on a Mac. Something else that my husband and I have just started doing for our personal budget is we've taken it out of QuickBooks and we're now putting it into a software called You Need a Budget. It's actually called youneedabudget.com. And there's lots of other programs like this on the web. So researching a tool on the web is a good idea. Yes?
There's another one called mint.com.
Okay. Mint.com. So lots of them out there.
And that one's free.
Yeah. And all you'd have to do is just think about, you've got these incomes, you've got these expenses. How am I going to tweak it so it fits into a family budget? But you can do it if you're creative with it. Also, from Advent Source, they do sell online software where you can do billing to your Pathfinders. If you're in a club as large as Pioneer Memorial Church, I would highly recommend doing something where you can actually bill the families, because you're dealing with 100 kids, which is a lot of finances to deal with. So bringing someone on your staff who is an accountant at a big church like that will be essential for you. If you're in a small church, then the church treasurer can just help you out, because they won't be as busy. So have a look around for different softwares. I don't want to go through how to use any of the softwares because there's teaching tools on the web to go with them. You just have to think about how you can put your budget that we went through into that and then expense from it. Okay?
So that software that the treasurers use, if you're familiar with that, can you use that also?
When my husband and I were church treasurers in Colfax, I was his assistant. I did the data entry for the church books, and that software could not be used. It was extremely good for what it did, but nothing else. So,
Advertising it.
yeah, it was very basic because again, it was created for church treasurers that don't know accounting.
Ah,
So, us in accounts and our background, and it didn't work. Yeah, I kept the books in Colfax in QuickBooks, but now I think I would think again because there's more cloud-based things. And then whoever you need to look in and record things can, so that you're not doing anything.
I was familiar with that one, but if you say it's so simple, it's like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the software that we used as accountants was called Joule, and it was, is that the same one? Yeah, Joule. Joule, no, it would not work for this. There's no reports. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I think we're finished and we'll sign off then. I hope you find it very useful, and I hope that, and I will give you emails of my handouts before I leave tonight. Yes, Gabby, you've got a question?
Oh, I was just gonna share that I downloaded an app today on my phone, and I'm not very good at uploading receipts. It takes pictures of my receipts and stores away. It scans all the information that was brought in. And,
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
have to share that.
Yeah. Gabby was just sharing there that she's downloaded an app on her phone that can take pictures of receipts.
What's it called?
What's it called again? She's looking up.
Receipt
Receipt,
stack. Receipt stack.
receipt stack.
And then it notices all the information on the receipt and stores it all the way itemized. So we have a budget thing going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So it stores a receipt and it itemizes it through to a budget, I think she said. So that's just one example of a tool out there that, yes.
Most times, when you do your budget, you have some left over, you're able to
Yes.
use it, or do the churches vary? Because I think I've heard of some churches that will absorb it, so if you don't
Right.
use it, and then they give you
Yes.
less the following year.
That can happen. Typically with Pathfinders, I've only seen it work where they let you carry your balance forward. But if you're not using the church subsidy, the following year they might say, well, you don't need your subsidy this year, we're not going to use it. So that would be a way of reducing it. But to be honest, if there's money left over at the end of the year, you might want to start an Oshkosh fund and put your leftovers there. If you're blessed with leftovers, it doesn't happen very much. We did in Colfax. There was like 9,000 in the account when I left.
Wow.
So you could spend it on a mission trip. There's always ways to be creative and use the money God's blessed the club with.
Yeah, our church goes on a zero balance, everything gets zeroed out,
Okay.
but certain ones, they can
Yes.
request that theirs is not zeroed out, or it's moved, the balance is moved to another fund.
Yeah. That's how we did it as well. Like electricity or utilities in a church got zeroed out, but Pathfinders and the Evangelism Fund was allowed to carry forward because it was a different type of purchasing going on. Thank you everybody for coming. It's been very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very good.